Hi guys, this is Lauren with Lauren Watkins Art, and today I have an intermediate watercolor tutorial for you. This apple painting is part of my ongoing beginner / intermediate watercolor series I've been working on that is in tangent with my in-person watercolor classes I've been teaching. The colors I've used for this painting are Quinacridone Red, Cadmium Red, Gamboge. You can use Cadmium Yellow Medium, Sap Green, ultramarine blue, mauve or a violet, and burnt sienna. And I just started out by sketching a pretty generic apple shape. And I'm just using a light hand as I'm sketching it so I don't indent my paper. Usually I'm a pretty big proponent for looking at a reference photo to help you know how to draw something. And I've looked at many apple reference photos. I've worked with apples a ton. I used to work on an apple farm, and so I can sketch an apple pretty easily off of memory. If you're struggling though, feel free to grab just some reference photos to just refer back to get an idea of what your apple looks like. Well, once I was happy with my basic sketch, then it was time to start mixing the colors for kind of the abstract background. I decided to start with the background, one, because it's going to take a lot longer to dry because there's so much water in it, and two, it kind of just sets the tone and the mood for this picture. Now, the background's going to be really heavy into wet washes, and so I am pre-mixing my colors. That way they can be ready to roll as soon as my paper's wet, because this paper is just Strathmore 400 watercolor paper. It's not cotton paper, so it's going to dry pretty quickly. So by having the colors pre-mixed, I can just wet it and get going, and I don't have to worry about the paper drying before I'm ready for it to dry. So I'm having the colors in this abstract background kind of come in at an angle from the top left to the bottom right corner. So that is how I wet it, and I didn't wet it uniformly. I kind of just dabbed water everywhere because I want it to have texture. I want it to be uneven. That's part of what this whole painting was designed for, was to create texture in unusual ways. So I'm adding Quinacridone Red to it, and ultramarine blue, and our violet color. I'm having it be a little bit darker, closer to the apple, just to kind of really add contrast and help it pop. I'm also having it have a little bit of a shadow on the bottom right hand side, because I'm going to have the highlight be on the top left side of this apple. I now put a paper towel over the apple to kind of help protect it, because we're going to start splattering paint soon, and I don't want that paint to get onto the main apple. So by putting a paper towel down, it just kind of helps protect it. Adding the splattering kind of helps add to that texture we've been building. So now I'm taking some Sap Green, and I'm going to kind of flick that into that background as well. This is because there's going to be green in that apple, and I want it to appear in the background as well, so that there's that harmony in the piece. It's also going to make some more neutral colors when it mixes with the reds, and then it's going to leave some colors vibrant because it's not going to mix with them, but it'll be next to the red colors. So here's something a little bit crazy. As this paper is super wet, I am taking some plastic wrap and I am setting it down on that wet paint, and I'm having it folded and wrinkled. And this is going to create some more of an abstract texture. This is a really fun technique to do if you are trying to create unique textures in your piece, especially if you're working abstractly and you're trying to kind of change up how your picture feels. The key to getting the saran wrap textured working is by making sure your paper and your paints are really wet when you put it down. And then it will just allow those colors to kind of clump together. And then you're going to let it dry like that for a while. I also sprinkled a little bit of salt in the areas that didn't have the saran wrap. I don't really know if it made much of a difference, honestly. But you can sprinkle in a little bit of salt because that creates another type of texture. It creates more of like a blooming texture. I'm splattering some more colors. Another thing you need to keep in mind when doing kind of these big texture pieces in your watercolor paintings is to make sure you're using quite a bit of pigment, because that's going to allow those textures to stand up. So I removed the bottom piece of saran wrap after it had dried. It's hard to tell how long I waited because this video is sped up and it's edited, but I probably waited 5 minutes. I pulled it off just a smidge too early. What I have found to be the best kind of wait time or best indicator when you're doing these kind of saran wrap textures is you'll notice little white spots forming in your colors that are kind of touching the saran wrap. And that is when it's an indicator that it's dry enough to remove and that it's not going to lose all those details we've worked so hard on. So once that background was pretty dry, and I did clean up some of the edges a little bit where the paint had flowed into the apple, I started working on the apple. Now, this is just a really pale yellow. I'm doing it for kind of those light yellow kind of highlights that you get in an apple. But you have to make sure your background is like 95% of the way dry before you start any of this. Because if your background's really wet while you start painting in the apple, the background color is going to flow into your apple, or your apple color is going to flow into your background, and it will just make a mess. So once I added the yellow, then I started in with an orange color. This is a mix of our Gamboge or cadmium yellow medium and our cadmium red. And we're just making kind of a base orange color. And then we're going to build up the layers and build up reds and violets and greens into our apple. I'm actually working pretty wet into wet in this area as well. This is going to allow some of those colors to kind of flow and blend in together and get soft shading and value changes within the apple. It's not a typical wet into wet wash where I didn't pre-wet the paper. I'm just dipping wet paint into wet paint that's already applied to the paper. So it's giving a similar effect. And then anywhere that it needs nudging to blend in a certain way, I'm just adding my paint. I'm just moving that pigment with my paintbrush. And I'm trying not to keep too smooth of a texture now. This is going to start building up the texture in the apple. This apple has a little bit of speckling and variation with a little bit of yellow, a little bit of green showing through. So I want to start building up that detail. With it still being a little damp on the paper, the details that I add are going to soften up just a little bit. So it's not going to be a super harsh line. It's going to just kind of soften up and start implying that little bit of variation. If you get an area that's too dark or too wet, you can use a paper towel to kind of just absorb that up because you don't want standing water. Now that white section that I haven't painted on the apple, that's where the highlight is going to be. And I am leaving that bright white because it's easier just to kind of let it be, and then I can tweak and adjust it to make it look more like a realistic highlight. But if I get paint in there, especially staining colors like the Quinacridone Red, it's going to be hard to lift off. So I've mixed our little bit of burnt sienna, ultramarine blue, and violet to kind of create this kind of dark inky blue color. And I'm going to use that for the shadow on the apple. Now, the shadow that I'm painting on this apple isn't exactly accurate to where the highlight's going to be. It sometimes bothers me in this picture because I didn't match it up exactly. But with it being kind of a more whimsical picture and a more abstract background, it wasn't the end of the world. But I added a little bit of a cast shadow to kind of add weight to the apple, make it look like it's not floating. And then I'm adding a little bit of darkness to the opposite side of that apple to help add contrast. This is going to allow that apple to really stand out, especially because I'm using more of a blue tone instead of pinks. So it's got more of a contrasting color and a contrasting value to really help the apple kind of stand out and change. Now I added a little bit of sea salt or kosher salt to that shadow area to kind of just soften up the edges and provide a little bit of texture. And then I'm just dabbing it up with a little bit of a paper towel. That way it was a little too harsh on the edge, and I wanted that shadow under the apple to kind of softly blend into the abstract texture that we've done on the background. Now I've let this all dry, and now I'm mixing up kind of a gradient from like a warm red to a warm orange. And I'm taking my smaller paintbrush and I'm going to start doing kind of dabs to start creating more texture, more of those imperfections and more of the nuance within the color of the apple. I'm starting with my oranges and then I'm going to build it up darker. Now with this apple piece, I was kind of in a hurry painting it in prep for my class. And so some of my dabbing strokes are a little bit too systematic. I wasn't as careful with this as the first one I did a couple months ago when I was kind of lesson planning for the class. So make sure your strokes and the dabbing motions you're doing aren't too similar. Sometimes you can overlap dabbing to make new shapes. You can hold your paintbrush in different ways, apply different pressures, just kind of change up what you're doing with your brush so that it's a little bit more random and not too systematic or the same. Another way you can do it is kind of changing the direction your painting is. So flipping your apple upside down can also help as well. So I'm taking a little bit of our Sap Green color and I'm just adding a little bit of that to the apple, because a lot of times apples can have kind of the spectrum of colors where it can go from green to yellow to orange to red. And part of that is just the ripening process. Some of that depends on the specific type of apple. But I'm adding a little bit of those green flecks into the apple to start building up that texture and contrast. And it's interesting, by adding just this little bit of value and that contrast in the background, and then the direction that we're adding the shading, our apple's already starting to look dimensional. Some of that's from our sketch, and some of that's by the way we've applied pigments and then the values within those pigments. So I've done kind of orange yellows and greens and reds, and then I added a kind of a magenta mix. So it's a mix of our Quinacridone Red and our little bit of our violet to kind of make a pinky purple color. And that's going to be a little bit more in the shadowed areas and the darker red tones. And I'm still sticking with that dabbing motion. We'll be doing some glazes over the top of this to kind of help blend it all together so it's not too textured. We don't want it to look like a fuzzy apple. But with these under layers, I'm just building up that texture, and then when we glaze over the top of it, we will smooth out some of that texture while some of it shines through. That's one of the fun things about doing glazing, whether it's with watercolor or if you're doing it in oil painting, where you make your main textures and designs and then you just gently glaze over the top of it with a really translucent layer. It allows you to kind of soften up details you've added, or you can kind of adjust the value of them, or adjust the color if you need to color correct a little bit. And so this is one of my favorite ways to use glazing, is to kind of soften up details. So in the middle layers, do pretty heavy detailing, and then anywhere that there's too much detail, just softening it up with a glazing layer. But again, I'm just building up these values, making it sure it's darker right on the edges of the apple and at the base of the apple, and then having kind of a gradient where it flows into more of those yellow and light orange values. You can see some of that glazing in effect right now. So I've picked up some of the color, and instead of doing a dabbing motion like I had been, I was just kind of using the side of my brush and just gently going back and forth on my brush strokes. That kind of started to soften up some of that glazing. Now don't go in hard with your paintbrush because that will lift up the layers that you've already done. I was just barely kissing the paper with my paintbrush, and I made sure that the previous layers were dry underneath. Now I'm starting to strengthen the shadows within this apple, because value really helps make something look dimensional. You want to show that kind of variation in light and shadow to really give that form to the apple. So I'm kind of thinking about where the shadows would be heaviest on this apple, where there would be highlights, and kind of how that value would gradually change. And I'm just doing that to help provide the form. So I've added a little bit more texture while I'm doing this. So when you're adding value, it doesn't have to be kind of like a flat wash. It can be textured like this, where you're just doing it over and over and over again to darken up an area. You can do flat washes. There's a lot of different ways that you can adjust the value. But I'm just using the Quinacridone Red to add a little bit more of a pink undertone to this apple. And then I'm taking a light orange to really help make that gradation from the yellow into the orange and red tones a little bit softer. So here you can see that I am kind of touching the paper. That is so I can make sure that the paper's dry. How you can tell the paper's dry is, one, it won't feel wet, but two, you know it will be completely dry when it no longer feels kind of damp or cool to the touch. It will feel room temperature. So I was just kind of touching that to make sure it was dry before I started in on this next layer of watercolor over the top of it. If you're working over something that's still wet, it's more likely to affect the pigments of paint that you've already put down on the paper. But if you let it dry completely and you use a soft brush, you can add more paint to it without disturbing too many layers. So I did a mixture of violet, blue, green, and Quinacridone Red, just in random sporadic patterns, and got that pretty wet. And now I put some saran wrap on it, and I'm just letting it dry with it on. This is just going to allow it to dry with a little bit of a texture. It's not going to be as drastic as when we first did this, because there's already a lot of layers of paint underneath, and so it's not going to have the value contrast within it. But I'm just letting that dry. I added burnt sienna and sap green to the stem. The little bit of green makes this apple look a little bit more fresh, like the stem hasn't dried completely. And then I'm just taking a violet mixture. It's violet and a little bit of Quinacridone Red, and I am starting to add those darker values within the apple, and really starting to kind of push the values on this to make it a little bit more, to have a little bit more of a contrast. Especially with the background being so busy, this apple really needs to be able to stand out from it. And so I really want those values to kind of pop. And then I'm just mixing up some yellows. And anywhere that I feel like it's a little bit too pink, I'm just glazing a little bit of that orange over the top. This will warm up those red tones and make it have variations on cool and warm tones. And this is kind of what I mean by color correcting by using glazing. So if you have used a lot more Quinacridone Red and it's not reading like a warm red apple, then you can take some of your yellow tones or your orange tones, so your Gamboge or your yellow, and you can just do a thin layer of like a yellow paint over the top of that, and it will warm that right up. And I'm just softly adding some more layers, softening up that texture we created. So taking a layer of paint, or getting a little bit of paint on my brush and kind of doing back and forth motions. You can see it's just softening up the texture of the apple. And then I'm just cleaning up some of the edges of the apple where it meets the background so that there's not too much of a halo effect from the apple and the background. A halo effect is where there's a little bit of white between like objects and the background. Sometimes that can be really useful, but sometimes it can make it just not look realistic or grounded. So I wanted to clean up some of those halo lines and just make sure the sides of the apple were the shape that I wanted them to be. And then I took the plastic wrap off the paper, and now I'm adding a little bit more of the quinacridone or the pinky red tones to the background, and a little bit of our sap green. Now, remember, sap or green and red are opposite colors, so it will kind of darken up wherever that green and red touch. So you need to be really careful about how you make those play together. But I got it really wet, and now I'm just putting some more saran wrap on that to create the background. Now, you don't have to do that on your own picture. If you are happy with your background and the way it looks, then you can just leave it be. If you don't want your background as dark as mine, you don't have to use as much paint or do as many layers. That's just you painting. You are in charge of your picture, and you can kind of push things as dark or as light or adjust the colors however you want. This tutorial is just kind of a guide to give you ideas on techniques, on what you can do, and how you can adjust your painting. So if you don't like something in particular on a painting that I do, you can adjust it. You don't have to follow along exactly. There's even things about this painting that I would do different if I was going to paint it again. I've actually painted this same kind of style of painting, the apple with the abstract background, like 3 or 4 times in preparation for my class. 2 of them were just kind of brainstorming when I was figuring out what I was going to teach. And then one was this one. And it was so that I could have a recording of it available for my students and for you guys. And then another version of it when I painted it in class. And each one turned out very different, and there's things I like about it, there's things I don't like about it. But I never painted it exactly the same each time because I was reacting to what my paints were doing to some degree so that I could work with my painting and make it the best it could be. So I have the background abstract areas done. You can see it's still a little bit wet in that top left corner because it's a little bit shiny. But I'm just kind of tweaking those last few details of this painting. I zoomed in a bit so you can see a little bit more in detail on what I was doing with it. So I am going to be doing a little bit of dry brushing on the apple. Dry brushing is when your paper is dry and your paintbrush has the minimal amount of water on it to deposit color onto your paper. So the brush won't add lots of water to your paper. It's gonna make it so the paint doesn't spread or move very much. And dry brushing allows you to create quite a bit of texture. It can also be used as a technique for blending. So I did some dry brushing to kind of add a little bit of texture, and now I'm coming in with a little bit more water on my brush and just kind of blending out any areas I want and just kind of tweaking the colors and adjusting it a little bit. Now, I think I pushed this a little bit too dark in some areas. I was just having fun painting. That's one of my biggest struggles as an artist is I'll have some music or an audio book or something going on, and I'll be listening to that while I paint, and sometimes I'll push things a little bit too far just because I'm just having so much fun in the painting process. So because I pushed some of the values a little bit too much in some areas, I'm just taking my paintbrush with some clean water and just kind of scrubbing it in those areas that I feel are a little too dark and lifting off the paint. Now, we purposely try to avoid this most of the time because it's an effect we don't want, but it can be really useful if you push values too dark and you darken things up too much with your watercolor, especially because with watercolor, the white of your paper is generally the only white you have unless you have white gouache or white ink. Since I wasn't using either for this painting for the most part, it was more beneficial to me to kind of just lift up those values just a little bit and highlight them. That way it wasn't too dark. And I will adjust these a little bit to fine tune them, but I'm just letting them dry before I adjust those. So you can see I've added a few little bits of texture on that bottom left side that I highlighted. And I'm just going to be tweaking and adjusting. This is a stage of the painting where it's really beneficial to kind of take a break. When you're about 85-90% of the way done with a picture, take a big break and then come back to it with fresh eyes. And then you can more objectively look at it and see what needs to be adjusted. Sometimes if we're staring at a painting or we're looking on something too long, we don't really see mistakes. We don't really see what needs to be adjusted. So take a break. You can go eat some lunch or, go to bed and then come back to it the next day or a couple hours later. And then you'll be able to see with fresh eyes and see what actually needs to be adjusted. This is something I've had to implement pretty strongly with like a lot of my commissioned works because sometimes I'm in a hurry and I just want to get it done. But then I'll think I'm done and then I come back the next day and realize that there's things that need to be adjusted. So I've learned that when I get to a certain point, just take a break, work on other projects, and then I can come back to it with fresh eyes and more accurately fix what needs to be adjusted on it. Because sometimes you can work on something a lot and still can't figure out what something's wrong or off on the picture, but you don't know what needs to be adjusted. Sometimes that's because you've been looking at it for too long. So anyways, I've just been adding some more details, using my reds and violets to kind of adjust them, and then reinforcing the shadows on this apple, making sure that the shadow on the stem is darkest on that kind of right hand bottom side of the apple. And just taking my small paintbrush, and I'm going to just give a little bit of highlights right at the top of the apple to kind of just soften it up a little bit. This paintbrush I'm using is a golden Taklon, so it has the yellow bristles on it, and so it's pretty stiff. So it lifts up the colors, and I'm just using the little paintbrush so that I have a lot of control on where it lifts the color. Sorry, my head's in the way. This was painted with the watercolor board kind of flat on the paper, and so sometimes I kind of have to lean in to see everything I'm doing. But I'm just kind of bringing back those highlights in the areas that I felt like just got a little bit too dark. I'm still being careful not to put too much water on the paper. That's partly why I'm using a small paintbrush. Because if I get a lot of water on the paper, then it potentially can lift up too much or too big of an area. So with the little paintbrush, I can just do those fine details. So then I signed the picture, and then I came back to it and realized there was a few more things I wanted to tweak. That happens to me a lot. But I'm just getting those last couple details. I wanted to kind of bring back some of the highlights in this abstract background, so I just kind of dabbed up some water on it and let it sit for a bit. And then I'm just absorbing some of it with my paper towel. And I have my paper towel wrapped around my finger, and I'm dabbing it and just lightly twisting. I'm not pushing really hard, but I'm just kind of twisting it to allow some of that color to lift off. Then that little blue line next to the apple didn't spread and blend quite as much as I'd wanted it to, so I added a little bit of water to that to help soften some of those lines. And this is just creating more texture and depth within this abstract background. By having that value variation within it, it's going to give it a little bit more depth instead of having it look like this flat wash of color. And I'm just going to keep doing this until I reach a point where I'm happy with kind of the value variation within this background. Here is the final piece. I hope this tutorial and lesson kind of gave you ideas on how to add texture in new ways to your piece, and that your backgrounds don't have to be smooth or ultra realistic. And I hope you will try this out. And if you have any questions about what I taught here today, you can leave them down below in the comments and I will do my best to answer them. If you like this video, please hit the like button. That really helps my channel out and helps other people to find them. And if you want to see more of what I create, please hit the subscribe button and notification bell. I will be posting a few more watercolor videos in the next few weeks, and then I will get back to kind of alternating between watercolor and soft pastels. So I hope you have a fantastic day, and I will see you next time.